All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. As always, my name is Devon. I'll be your host for today, and today we're going to be talking about the rotation of mental images. So that'll be the kind of paradigm that we're doing today. If you're familiar with our ePrime experiment library, this is also on there. So what we're going to be making today is going to be very similar to what you see on our website. So it'll be kind of a step-by-step guide on how to build that experiment. So in order to build my experiment, I'm going to first start in eStudio. I'm using ePrime 3, of course, and I'm going to start with just a blank template. You can do that by either clicking on blank and clicking OK, or if you just click cancel in this box here, it'll actually just bring up a blank template anyway, because that's what loads when you load ePrime. I'm going to go on to my session proc. So the session proc is just a timeline of events in my experiment. The left side of the screen there, that is the beginning of my experiment, and the right side of the screen, the little red dot there, that is the end of my experiment. Now I'm going to make this just by adding objects from my toolbox here and just adding them to my experimental timeline. So the objects I want to be at the beginning of my experiment will be on the far left, and the objects I want at the end of my experiment are on the far right. Now my experiment today is not only going to be just a simple rotation of mental images task, but it's also going to include a practice section and some critical trials. The letters that I present for my rotation of mental images are going to be different, and I actually have my images here. I can show you guys. They're under resources. This is actually part of what gets downloaded when you download the mental rotation sample or experiment from our experiment library. And I'm actually going to click view, and I'll do large icons here. So here are the images that I have. They are rotated and mirrored F, G, L, N, P, Q, and R. And this is what participants are going to be responding to. Now, I like to view these images instead of like this, even though I can see the images. I like to view them by detail. It just makes it easier for me for a couple of reasons. First, it actually tells me the name in a nice little list here, which looks really similar to the list objects in ePrime. But also, I like this this image type here. Image type relates to just the type of image that it is, and this is what I'm going to have to put in as the file extension in ePrime. So right now, I know that all of these files are .bmp files, so it's going to make it nice and easy for me to go ahead and see that later whenever I, make it nice and easy for me to see that whenever I go to load these into ePrime. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make just a very simple welcome screen for participants. I'm going to do that just with some text. So I'm going to take a text display object from my toolbox and just drag it and drop it to the first object in my experiment session proc. I'm going to right click to rename this object to welcome. And as I always mention, the name of an object should follow its function. So since this, the purpose of this text display object is to welcome participants to the experiment, we'll just go ahead and click call it welcome. Now I'm going to double click on it to open it in the workspace here, which is this big area here. And I'm just going to start typing. So this is going to be very simple. Just welcome to the experiment. Press spacebar to continue. There we go. Now, one thing that I have mentioned in past webinars, I do want to also bring up with this one, is that right now the text looks like it's going to be displayed at the top of the screen. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's where it's going to be when the experiment runs, though. And I can tell by clicking on this properties page here. And if I click or look at this align horizontal and align vertical property, if I take a look at these two, I'll see that they're both set to center. That means whenever this runs, I'm going to see this in the center of the screen. And I can actually test that out now. If I go to File and click Save, it's always important to save your experiments, I'm actually going to save this one on my desktop in this Mental Rotations webinar folder. And this one's just going to be called Mental Rotation Sample. Now that I have it saved, I'm going to go ahead and run it quick, just to make sure that this shows up exactly where I want it to. This is kind of how we recommend doing things in ePrime, especially if you're building a really large, complex experiment. Just chunking it into very little, manageable pieces and make sure that they look exactly how you want them to look before you go ahead and start to get more complex with your experiment. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this button here. This is actually our windowed mode button. As you can see here in my test manager, I have a lot of different options for running this. I can scale up the clock to up to 4 times its normal speed. I can enable auto response from the keyboard. I have the option to output an experiment advisor report that'll tell me about any possible design or timing flaws in my experiment. But most importantly, this run configuration, I want to run this experiment in windowed mode. And I'm just going to restore the device scale from last run. I don't necessarily need to change the size of it right now. And then down here, this quick start, while not very apparent now, it allows me to select the objects that I want to run when I run this. So if I'm only troubleshooting a part of my experiment, I can troubleshoot that part explicitly. So go ahead and click Test, and it comes up with this eRun experiment window, and I just want to see how this is going to look. So as you can see, that showed up in the middle of the screen. But the one thing you'll notice is that it automatically disappeared. I want this to stay on the screen for as long as participants are able to see it, and then press the spacebar to continue, and it didn't do that. So if I click on the Properties page here, I want to go to the Duration Input tab. Now the Duration Input tab is what controls how long the object is on the screen and how participants are responding to the object. Right now, if you look, it's just on the screen for 1,000 milliseconds, which is equal to 1 second, obviously. And I don't have anything to respond to. This input masks section here is completely blank. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change the duration from 1,000 to infinite. And I'm going to change my data logging from none to time audit only. What this does is it actually just logs the different timing properties of this object. So if I go to the logging tab here, you're going to see that now that I have selected time audit only here in my duration input tab, if I go to logging, I'm actually logging duration error, onset delay, onset time, and onset to onset time. Now the important one is going to be the onset to onset time. And as you can see here, it's difference between the next and this onset time. So what that means, it's going to be the difference between this object's onset time and the next object's onset time. And what this is going to get us is the truest sense of this object's duration. So this is how long the object is really on the screen, and that's really the important thing here for this object, since it's not a critical data logging object, or I'm not getting really any important dependent variables from the welcome screen. So I do want to log some, because I always like to say, you know, it's better to have more data than not enough. But I'm just going to log only the time audit properties just to know that it was on the screen. I'm going to hop back over to my duration input tab, and I'm going to click Add here for my input masks. Now I said that I want participants to press the spacebar to continue, and the only one of these objects that contains a spacebar is the keyboard. So I'm going to click on keyboard and click OK to add it to my list of devices here. Now that I have my keyboard as my device, I want to change the allowable property. Right now it's set to any, so participants can literally take their hand and mash it on the keyboard and it will move on. I like a little more precise than that. So I'm going to change it from any to just whatever the spacebar is. Now, I know that beginners to E-Prime, this might be a little bit of a difficult concept, because I know I personally am guilty of just typing spacebar. And if you type spacebar in there and click apply, E-Prime is going to give you an error message that says value contains duplicate entries. And in this case, E-Prime is looking at this A here. It's looking at an A, and then it sees another A, and it goes, oh, these are two different A's. This isn't actually the spacebar in E-Prime. To reference the spacebar in E-Prime, you do these little curly brackets. This is E-Prime's way of saying, okay, this is going to be a special character or a special key on the keyboard that we're going to enter. And if you just type in the word space in all caps there, that is how you would enter spacebar in E-Prime. So that allowable property is set up exactly the way I want it to. Now the only thing they have to press is space. So I mean, it goes without saying any response to this is going to be a correct response. So we don't necessarily need to fill anything out there. As far as time limit's concerned, it's set to same as duration. Now, this is a property that confuses some people in E-Prime, and it's understandable. It sounds a little similar to duration, but they're two very different properties. So everything up here in this top part relates to the text display object as a whole. So the duration specifically says how long is my text display object called welcome going to stay on the screen. Now down here, this time limit property relates specifically to this input mask here. It relates to the keyboard input mask, and you see if I add another input mask here, like if I go to mouse, these properties change, and if I change time limit here to, let's say, 2000, if I go back to my keyboard, that changes. That's because these properties are specific to whatever input mask is highlighted on the left here. Now the time limit property explicitly says how long do participants have to respond using this input mask. In this case, I'm going to keep it as same as duration, because I like them to be able to press the spacebar whenever. But if I want to, I can restrict it to only 1,000 milliseconds. So participants only have 1,000 milliseconds to press the spacebar, or they can't press it anymore. It's not very practical for this setup, so I'm just going to keep it as same as duration and its default. And then end action is what happens once I make this response with the keyboard. So am I terminating, which means I stop this object and move on to the next one. If I want participants to respond, but I don't want the object to move on, I would change my end action from terminate to none. But in this case, or I can also do jump too, which would allow it to move on to any other point in the experiment that you define. But for now, I'm just going to keep it to terminate. And if you ever want to check out advanced properties, just click on this advanced tab. Max count dictates how often or how many times you can press the space bar. Flush input buffer is once it's done, does it get rid of all of the responses. Terminate response, if you have a lot of possible keys and you would like, let's say, the enter key to end the text display object, that's where you would put that. And user tag is mostly for the data file. It's where you input something special. So I mean, if I want to log this as like the welcome or something like that, it's going to show up in my data file under the user tag as like the welcome. That's going to be more for like very complex experiments where you have very specific variables that you want to manipulate through that. So I'm just going to keep this exactly the way it is, and now I'm going to go ahead and run it in window mode one more time. I'm going to set my subject number to 0, and as you can see here, 0 is a shortcut for no data logging. I don't really need my data logging right now, so I'm going to click yes. And as you can see here, this is now up for however long I want. I press the spacebar, and E' ends the experiment. So now I know that my object is working exactly the way I want it to work. And if I scroll up through here, all I'm doing here is just looking at the different parts of the script here. So this is just the full script of my experiment after it's run. This is everything that happened. I don't necessarily need to look at this right now. I'm going to go ahead and click exit. Alright, so now that I have my welcome text display object up, the next thing I want to do is actually give participants instructions on what they're going to be doing on this task. So if I take a text display object and put it just after my welcome object, and I'm going to rename this from text display 1 to instructions 1. Because this is where I'll be giving participants instructions. And double click on it, and then these instructions will be a little bit longer, so I'm going to type them all out quickly. In this task, you will be looking at letters. Some of the letters will be rotated slightly. That's the whole mental rotation part. Some of the letters will be mirrored or opposite of how they normally appear. And you can actually see that. If I go to my resources, and if I just view this by large icons, so you can see like this F is mirrored even though it's like upside down. This F is normal. This F is just rotated. So this isn't necessarily opposite of the way that it appears. It just appears rotated. There you go. So your task is determine if the letter, let me fix the spelling here. If the letter is a mirror image of how the letter normally looks, press spacebar to continue. I'm going to give just a little more instruction than our, I was just reading off of the experiment library version. Give a little more instruction here. So I'll say if. So the way that this is set up, that if it is a mirror, or if the letter is a rotation of the normal letter, and not mirrored, press 1 on the keyboard. I'm going to make a lot of spelling mistakes. If the letter is a mirror and not a rotation, the normal letter, press 2 on the keyboard. And then press spacebar to continue. So now that we have all of our instructions set, and I know that I press 1 if it's just a rotation, or 2 if it is a mirror. And I spelled mirror wrong there too. There we go. So all I need to do is just the exact same edit I did to my welcome. I would like to click on this properties page here, click on duration input, change the duration to infinite, add a keyboard. Whoops, there you go, add a keyboard. Change my data logging to time audit only, change my allowable to space, and keep everything else at its default value. So that's really all I need to change at this point in order for my experiment to go kind of exactly how, or this part of the experiment to go exactly how I want it. I've already made these changes before and already tested them out on my welcome screen, so I don't necessarily need to really go back into my windowed mode and try that again. At that point, it'd just be kind of a little much. So all I'm going to do now is just go ahead and start making my actual list object. So I'm going to go into my session proc here. I'm going to take a list object. So list objects, for those of you who are new to ePrime, the purpose of list objects are to control either the flow of an experiment, so determine, if there are multiple blocks in the experiment like this one's going to do. This is actually going to tell me if the participant's going to run practice trials or critical trials. But then later on, we're going to use list objects to actually take a look at the independent variables in our experiment. We're going to manipulate them through the list objects. So I'm going to rename this one just to block list. I'm going to double click on the block list to open it. Now in here I said the purpose of the block list is to differentiate between whether or not participants are running practice trials or critical trials. Obviously practice trials are going to come first, so let's go ahead and actually make the practice trials. So the only change I need to make here is to this procedure here. If I go into procedure, all I need to do is just type proc. There we go, and hit enter. I get this warning message that says the procedure proc does not exist. Would you like to create it? I would like to, and if you take a look at my timeline over here or my experiment structure, you're going to see this little yellow question mark change from a question mark to a procedure sign. And then, would you like to make this procedure the default value for newly created levels? What this means is every time I make a new level in this list object, do I want it to be my proc? And I don't. I'm going to actually have a proc and I'm going to have critical trials, so I don't want this to be the default value because I don't want to keep adding this one. I only want one. So I'm going to go ahead and click no. So now if I look at my experiment structure, I have a new level here, or a new procedure that looks blank, looked identical to my session proc when I made it, but it's just a new timeline of events. And since the context changed, the purpose of this little green circle and this little red circle changed. So on my session proc, this is experiment begin and experiment end, but since I'm looking at practice proc right now, the context has changed. This little circle is practice procedure begin, and this little red circle is practice procedure end. So what's contained on here is going to be the entirety of my practice trials. So all I want to do is just let participants know that they're going to be practicing this first before they actually do the critical trials, because there's nothing in any of my instructions that lets them know they're going to be practicing it. So I'm going to take a text display object and make it the first object of my proc, and I'm just going to rename this to proc begin. Just very simple, so in my data file I know that this is where they begin the practice. And I'm going to just write some very simple text here. Alright, so get ready. You will now begin the practice trials. And I'm going to click on the duration input tab again, and I'm actually just going to change this to 2000 milliseconds and change my data logging to time audit only. The reason I'm not actually allowing participants to respond in the same way that they did to welcome in instructions 1 is because they don't really need to respond to this. All they need to do is see this on the screen and go, okay, I will be practicing now, and then the practice trials will begin. I just changed the time limit up so it's on screen a little longer, so participants have plenty of time to read this. Now, if you take a look at the top here, you'll see that everything that I've opened so far is kind of on a little tabbed list up here. And if I click on this right arrow here, I can actually cycle through all of my tabbed lists, or all of my tabbed objects here. And if I click on this window listing button, I can actually see all of the windows that I have open and what type they are. So if I look here, I can see that my proc begin object is a text display. My proc is a procedure. Those kinds of things. So it's really nice if I want to jump to anything in particular. But I kind of like to make things neat here. So I'm going to take all my windows and I'm just going to cascade them here because I'm going to do something kind of fun. Once they're cascaded, if you click window and then click close all, they all close in a very satisfying way. So I'm going to close them all just to make sure that my workspace here is nice and clean. So I'm going to open my proc one more time, and I'm going to take my list object, and now I'm going to actually make all of the independent variables, or manipulate all the independent variables for my practice set of procedures. So this one is going to be called proc trial list. because it is a trial level list object, because this is my block level here. So the next level down is a trial level, and you can see that by going into your data file here. Session is right here in my experiment. Block is this level of my experiment. The next one is trial. This is a trial level list object specifically for the practice procedure. Now this object is going to be a little bit involved, unlike the last one. So I actually want participants to respond to L. Actually, if I take a look at I'm just going to do F. Participants are just going to respond to F, and they're going to respond to whether or not it's mirrored, normal, or rotated, just like the instructions say. And I actually just want participants to run through these things twice. So I want them to run through this set of 4 F trials. I want them to run through it twice. So what I'm going to do is I need to first, I'm actually going to change my view here, the details, that way I can see the name pretty clearly. Now if I'm running through my F trials twice, there are 4 different F images, so I actually need to make this 8 levels. So if I click on this button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another level. These levels directly relate to a trial in E prime. So right now I have 3 trials. If I keep going, I have 4 trials and 5 trials, and I'm actually going to make this 8 trials. So I have 8 trials that participants are going to run, but I don't have any data filled out. I just know that E prime is going to try to run 8 trials. So the first thing I need to do is I want to add a new procedure, and this is going to be called prac trial proc. Actually, you know what? Yeah, I'll call this prac trial proc. Sorry, I had a thought there, and I'm going to get rid of that. So it says prac trial proc does not exist. Do you want to create it? I'm going to click yes. Would I like to make a default value for newly created levels? I'll click yes, even though I already made my levels. So if you don't see all of the text in your procedure here, if you take your little mouse and put it just to the right of the procedure column there, if you click on it, it'll auto adjust in size. And then if you take your mouse and drag it to the bottom right hand corner of any cell of a list object, a little fill handle will appear. If you hold your mouse down and drag it all the way down to where you want it to fill in and let go, it'll automatically fill in the value with whatever you want. Now each one of these needs to be prac trial proc, because this is what's going to hold all of the objects in my procedure. So this is where the fixation is going to be, where the images are going to show up, and where my feedback is going to happen. It's just all in this prac trial proc here. So I'm going to click one more object here. Instead of adding another level here to add another trial, I'm going to add something called an attribute. And an attribute in a list object is just a column here that can be referenced later by E prime. So I'm going to add an attribute, and this attribute in this case is just going to be called something very basic. It's just going to be called image. So the image is just the image that's going to be shown to participants. Now this is where this came in handy, where I actually made this look like where I showed the details mode here, because I want to actually look at the name of the image and the file type. So in this case, I'm going to do fmirror.bmp, and that's going to be my image name. And then fmirror2, fnormal, and frotate. So I will do fmirror.bmp. And I'm going to double check that just to make sure I have it right. Yeah, fmirror. And then, oh, it's capital F. There we go. So fmirror2.bmp. Fnormal. And is it rotate? Yep, rotate. There we go. And I'm going to double click on this to expand it just so I can see all of them. Now, instead of having to write all of that out again, all I have to do is highlight the 4 that I want, hit Control-C to copy, select the first blank cell I have, and click Control-V to paste, and it automatically pastes them down there. So now I have all of my images I'm going to present to participants. Now what I want to do is I want to actually add a correct answer column, because I had mentioned earlier that if it's not mirrored and just rotated, I want participants to click 1. If it is a rotation of the image, or is a mirror of the image, I want them to press 2. So I'm going to go into my prac trial list, and I'm just going to make an attribute here called correct answer, and hit enter. Well, Windows wants me to update again. I'm going to not do that. You'd like to see that right in the middle of these live streams. So my correct answer for a mirror is going to be 2. So the first 2 here are 2, and my normals are going to be 1. So I'm just going to type all those in individually. My two mirrors are responding with 2. My normal and my rotate, which aren't mirrored obviously, are just going to be a response of 1. So I'm going to keep that there. And then I'm going to make one more column, and this one is actually just going to be called mirror. And it's going to be something that I use for my data later, and it's going to be, is this trial mirrored? Just call this mirror. And for the first 2, I'll put yes. And for the other 2, I will put no. And since this copies identically, all I need to do is fill in the first 4 trials, hit Control-C and Control-V. And now I have that all set up. Now the only thing that I want to change now is my randomization technique. And if I take a look here, it's sequential, which means E' is going to run trial after trial after trial in this order. They're going to get mirror, mirror 2, and then 2 of the non-mirrored ones. So the responses are always going to follow this pattern of 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1. And that's not necessarily great because participants might catch on before the end. So if I go to properties page here, click on reset exit, or sorry, selection here, and change selection from sequential to random, and click apply and OK, what this is going to do is it's actually going to randomize all of my stimuli here. It's going to make sure that each stimuli is presented only once, so participants are going to see all 4, well, all 4 twice, so all 8. They're going to see all 8 images that I have here, and once one is selected, it won't be selected again. So that's exactly how I want. Now this is all set up, so now I just need to reference the correct answer in the image. I need to actually show participants these things. So let's hop into trial proc here. The first thing I want in my experiment, or in my trial proc, is a fixation object. Just something to kind of hone participants into the center of the screen there so I know exactly where they're looking. So I'm just going to rename this text display object to fixation, and it's just going to be a very simple plus sign in the center of the screen. I will verify that it's in the center of the screen by checking my line horizontal and line vertical properties. And then I'm going to go to the duration input tab and change my duration from 1000 milliseconds to just 500 milliseconds. And of course I'm going to change data logging to time audit only, as per usual. I'm not going to enter an input mask here because I don't want participants to respond to the fixation, so I'm going to keep everything down here blank and just go ahead and click OK to continue. Next to my trial proc, I want to actually present the image to participants. Now I have 2 ways to present that. The most efficient way to do it in E' would be to use this image display object here. What this is going to do is it's going to take the image that you want to display, and I'll just add it here quickly, and it will present it in this area here. Now this is a little big, and I don't necessarily need it to fill up the entire screen, but if you do, the image display is the way to go. I'm actually going to delete this, and instead of adding an image display, I'm actually going to add a slide object. Now what the slide object allows me to do, and I'm going to open it quickly, what it allows me to do is it allows me to take an image display, very similar, if you see these icons are even identical, take an image display and present it wherever I want. So if I want it to show up in the top left corner, I can make it appear only in the top left corner of the screen. Same for bottom right or wherever you so choose. Now the one thing I didn't do here is I didn't actually rename my slide 1. It's just called slide 1. And that's not ideal because I want its name to match its function. So instead of changing it here or in my procedure, I'm actually going to change it in my properties window. And instead of slide 1, I'm just going to call it stimulus. And I'm going to hit enter. And if I make that change in my properties window, you can see it changes up here and it changes on my experiment explorer. Everything is all completely changed. So now I want to change the properties of this image. If you can see here, the little image icon is gray, which means that it's not getting any image right now. So if I go on the properties page here, click on the sub-object properties page icon up there, I want to go to frame, and I want it to actually show up in the exact center of the screen just like the fixation did. So if I change my position, the X value to center and the Y value to also center, as you can see here, it snapped from wherever it was to the very center of the screen. Now right now I think 25% of the screen is a little small, so let's change the width. The height and width properties here, as well as the X and Y properties, these can be set to percentages of the screen, which is generally speaking what we recommend. This allows me to take this experiment and kind of put it on any computer I want, and instead of using exact pixel locations, which is our other possible input type, pixel locations and pixel sizes, it allows it to just kind of form with the size of the screen itself. This allows for a much more consistent viewing option or viewing mode in my experiment, because what it's going to do is it's going to always take up 25% of the screen no matter how big or small the screen is. So that way, 10 text won't get clipped off, images won't get clipped off, anything like that, regardless of the size of monitor on which you display this. So I am going to maintain this instead of putting exact pixel value for my height and width, and some paradigms do call for that, so know that that is an option here. I can change this from 25% to 50%, and I can click apply, and you can see that that now got bigger. One of the things that ePrime does really well too that's important to bring up here is any one of these properties, not only can they be set using these little shortcuts we have, or pixel values. If I want X to be a pixel value of 800, I can do that, and that is now moved over to 800 on the X. I can do pixel values. I can also, if I want, do attribute references. So I can say like the X location as an attribute reference here, and what that's going to do is it's going to look for an attribute either set via script or on my list object called the X location, and when the experiment runs, it will appear in that location. Now there's a little trick to that as well in ePrime. If you do a colon and then you do center, after that, what it's going to do is there's not going to look like there's any change, but this colon and everything after the colon with an attribute reference like this is where it temporarily is for design time. So if I were to change this from center, because there wasn't a very good sample, if I do top, oops, I spelled top right. Whoops. If I do something like, oh, sorry, it's X. So if I do right, for example, and hit apply, what it's going to do is, while I'm in design time, the X location of this object is going to be right, but when it runs, it's going to resolve as whatever my attribute reference is. That's another little handy thing to do in ePrime, but it's a little more than what we're doing today. So I'm going to save my X value as center there. And the only other property I shouldn't have closed out of that I need to change is this file name property. Now, adding an image is pretty easy in ePrime. You can either add one image at a time by clicking on that button. It'll look in the current folder, and it could either, and you can add an image individually. So if I click apply, that's what it ends up looking like, and that actually looks pretty good. The other way that you can edit this too is you can do stretch. If I change stretch from no to yes and keep it as both, you can see that it grows a little too big and it looks a little distorted, so I'm not actually going to do that. I'm just going to keep it at its normal size. But that's how you would add one. But the important thing about adding one is it actually does a good job of formatting what this file name property should be. Now, if you notice, all of my images are in a folder called resource. So this is my ES2 file here, this mental rotation sample. And if I look here, all of my resources are where my images are. So I need to actually point ePrime at that resources folder. So I would type resources here, do a /, not a backslash, and then type the name of my image here. But since the name of my image is going to be varying based on trial and it's held in an attribute reference called image, I would just make an attribute reference to that image column that I made in my prac trial list. And I would do that by typing image right here. So now when ePrime runs, it's not going to say image, it's actually going to fill itself in with either fmirror, fmirror2, fnormal, frotate, and it's going to continually change on a per trial basis. So that's exactly what I want. I'm going to go ahead and, now that I have everything visually set up on my slide object, I want to change the actual input properties of this. So if I go to the properties page icon here, and go to duration input tab, I'm going to change the duration to 3 seconds. So participants do have a time limit. They can only respond in 3 seconds, but it's a pretty long time limit. Now I'm going to change my data logging to standard, and I'm going to click apply to show you what that looks like. So if I click on logging here, you'll see that I have my onset delay, onset time, so everything that my time audit property was logging already. But in addition to that, I also have accuracy, correct response, accuracy, so did they answer right or not right, correct response, so what were they supposed to have pressed on that trial, response, so what was their actual response, reaction time, which is the difference between when this object appeared on the screen and when the participant responded, and this property here called RT time, which is the difference between the start of the experiment and when the participants responded. So this all look good to me, so I'm going to hop over to duration input tab again, and I'm going to add a keyword input mask. This should be pretty familiar at this point. Now, allowable, instead of hitting space, I'm actually going to put 1 and 2. It looks like a 12, but since our advanced property here says max count of 1, instead of typing 12, it's going to expect either a 1 or a 2. If I want it to be 12, I would change my max count here from 1 to 2, but since I'm not doing that and I only want to press 1 or 2, I'll keep that at 1. And I also have a correct response here, and that's that correct answer. And I'm just going to make another attribute reference like that. just like I did with the image. So now whenever I run the experiment, instead of saying correct response of correct answer, it's going to resolve to either a 1 or a 2 based on whatever is here. And E prime is going to tie that correct answer with the image because it is in this row here. And E prime reads from this list object this way. So this image is now forever tied with a correct answer of 2 and a mirror property of yes. Alright, so now it looks like I have my slide set up exactly how I want. The last piece of my trial proc then is just a feedback. So I'll take a feedback display, and I will drag it and drop it just after my stimulus object. Feedback display 1 honestly is a very descriptive name. I don't necessarily need to change it, but I'm just going to change it to something simpler. So just feedback. I double click on it to open it, and as you can see, these are just pre-set up slide objects. So they look very similar to my stimulus object, with the exception of these tabs at the bottom. And if I go into this properties page, this little properties page tab here, you'll notice that this general tab is much different than my slide object. The most important property that we need to keep in mind is this input object name property. Now this input object name property is basically telling E prime to what object are participants responding, to what object am I judging correct response. And if I click on this down button, there's a list of all of my objects in the experiment, and of course participants are responding to stimulus. And that's what I want to judge with this feedback display object. So I'm going to click on stimulus, I'm going to click OK, and we are all set now. If I just take a look at some of the properties here, if I go to duration input, 1500 milliseconds is perfectly fine for a feedback display. My data logging I will put on time audit only. And they don't necessarily need to respond to anything using the input mask. So I'm just going to pretend like there's nothing there. And click OK. So now I have all of my practice trials set up. So now that I have my practice trials, I need to actually jump into my critical trials, which is pretty easy. All I need to do is go back into my block list. And how I mentioned before, the block list is what handles the flow of the experiment. So am I running practice or critical trials? If you look at my block list, right now I'm only handling practice trials. So I need to go ahead and add another level. Now, since I set that make default value for newly created levels property to no, every time I click add level here, this is just a completely blank row. So my new procedure is just going to be called block proc. It doesn't exist, but I'd like to create it. Of course I would. And now if you look underneath of my practice procedure here, I have a block proc. So this means in E prime, participants are going to run this task from the top down. They're going to hit welcome, instructions, practice begin, and then they're going to run the practice trials. And at this point too, once you make some changes like this, it is always important to save, but then it's also important to test it. So let's go ahead and test this experiment quickly using our windowed mode. And the one thing that I did already test that I don't necessarily need is this welcome screen. I know it works, so I'm actually just going to uncheck it so it doesn't run this time, and I'm going to click test. I'll keep data logging turned on, just so I can see what I'm getting. So if I take a look here, it says file name on image display not set. So it's looking at image display1.load properties. Now this is a little bit tricky because if you remember in our stimulus object, we absolutely did add a file name here. See, it says resources. We have a file name here and it's pointing at practice trial list. But if you remember earlier, I had added an image display object just to show you what it looked like. It's still an unreferenced E-objects, and this brings up a really good point about unreferenced E-objects. Unreferenced E-objects are kind of best thought as E prime's recycle bin, if you will. It's like the recycle bin on your computer. Everything down here has the potential to be loaded and used at runtime in the experiment. So even though it's technically an unreferenced E-objects, it does load as part of E prime. So if I look here, E prime was right. It says file name on image display has not been set, and if I look here at the file name property, it's not set. So even though this object is an unreferenced E-object, it's what's causing our experiment not to run. So I'm actually going to completely get rid of this object, and if I have a lot of objects in my unreferenced E-object section, there's a really easy way to do that. If you right click on unreferenced E-objects, it says delete all from unreferenced E-objects, or you can do the same thing by pressing shift or delete. If I click on that button, you get this error message that said all of these objects will be destroyed. I want to do that, and now if I run my experiment, I'm not going to get that error message. So as you can see, our welcome display didn't show up. This is our instructions one that we made. I'm going to press spacebar to continue. Those are my practice trials, and I'm just going to respond to some of these as they appear. So it looks like my feedback display is working. I'm getting both correct and incorrect. I'm actually just pressing 1 to every trial right now. So mirrored, not mirrored. These look like they're acting correctly. And it's giving my response time. And that was 8 trials, so now it's over. I'm going to go ahead and click exit. And then an important thing, if you're just doing practice trials, is just take a look at the EDAT file, just to make sure that you're getting the kind of data that you want before you have your whole experiment already set up. So if I look at my data file, it looks kind of big. There's kind of a lot of stuff in here. So if I go to this arrange columns and remove all, the only thing I'm really looking for here is accuracy, response time, and response for my stimulus object. So I'm going to add that, and I'm also going to add my mirror object. I'm going to click OK. So what I have here is I have my stimulus.response. So this is what I pressed. And as I said, I pressed 1 a lot. I pressed 2 like once. That's my reaction time, so that's how quickly I was reacting to. And here are my mirrored properties. Now what I can do here is I can click on this Analyze button, and I'm going to do this right now and show you how this will happen later. So I can just do RT by mirror state. And what RT by mirror state is going to do is I'm actually going to have it show my stimulus RT to RT and ACC. And I'll do my accuracy as well. So am I responding quickly and accurately to different mirrored or non-mirrored images? So I'll just find my mirror here, and I will drag it and drop it into columns, and I'll click run. So in times when it was mirrored, it looks like my accuracy is pretty low. My accuracy is much higher at 75% when it is not mirrored. And when it's mirrored, it looks like I'm responding much slower. So now that I have this all set up, I'm going to actually save this analysis file, and it's just RT by ACC, or RT and ACC by mirror state, and it just saves as an analysis file. I'm going to click I'm going to click save to save that, and it does exist. So I'm going to close out of this, and I'm going to show you how to use that later after we make the rest of the experiment. This would kind of simulate running pilot data, for example, of your experiment. You would want to save one of those analysis files for later. So now that I have my block list, let's actually make the critical trials so I can run those in my experiment as well. They're going to look very similar to what I have here, and I'm actually going to be using parts of this practice trial proc as well. So the first thing I need to make is a text display that's very close to my prac begin. This is just going to be called critical begin. So these are the critical trials, and they're beginning. And this is just going to say, thank you very much for completing practice trials. Now we will move on to the critical trials. Press space to begin. Alright, I'm going to click on the properties page icon here, click on my duration input tab, and I actually want this to stay on the screen. I don't want it to jump right from my practice trials to my critical trials. I want participants to have a little bit of a breather. So I'm going to change my duration here from 1000 to infinite. I'm going to add a keyboard input mask. I'm going to change my data logging here to standard just so I know how long they've stayed on this. And I'm going to change my allowable again to space. And that's all I need to change about this. Pretty easy. Alright, so now I'm going to make my list object. And I'm going to try to make this one as quickly as possible because there are ways that you can make this edit take a long time. So I'm going to just call this one trial list. And it's going to look very similar to my prac trial list. So I'm actually going to open my prac trial list and then open my trial list. And I'm going to jump back to prac trial list. And this is exactly the structure I want for it. I want my procedure, I want my image, and I want my correct answer and my mirror. So in my trial list, I'm going to make a procedure just called trial proc, which is prac trial proc just without the prac part. It does not exist, so I'd like to create it. Would I like to make a default value for newly created levels? I will click yes. Now in this case, I need to take a look at all of the images that I have to present. If I take a look at my resources, it says that I have 26 items in this folder. And if I select all of them, I do. But if you notice, I'm not going to use these first 4. So if I only highlight just the ones I want, it's 22 items, which means that my list object here is only going to be 22 trials long. So I'm going to click this. Instead of clicking add level another 21 times, I'll click add multiple levels, and I will type 21. So now I have a total of 22 trials, and as you can see, my trial proc was automatically filled in. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one attribute, and I'm going to keep it blank for now. I'm going to jump back into my trial proc. I'm going to highlight these 3 columns, and I'm going to hit Control-C on the keyboard. I'm going to jump back to trial list and hit Control-V, and now it fills in these first couple trials for me. The benefit of this, since I'm not using F, is the only thing I really have to change now, if you look at my resources, is just the letter in front of it. So I already have mirror, mirror 2, normal, and rotate, but instead of F, I need to put G, L, P, Q, and R. So I'm actually going to just copy all of these, hit Control-C, and paste them twice. And what this is going to allow me to do then is instead of F, or instead of having to type out the entire file name, all I need to do is just change one letter of each of these. Whoops. There we go. Change that to a G. So then the next letter that I have to do instead of G is going to be an L. And as you can see here, when I try to type L, E prime is actually going to try to autofill for me. It'll say, oh, I've seen this before. I'm going to fill this in for you. You don't necessarily need to. And then now that I have that, it doesn't autofill. All right, now that I have my L's, the next one I have to do is an N. Then I have a P. And then a Q. Oops. And then after my Q, I have an R. And then those are all of my trials. Whoops. So what I did there is I had accidentally pressed enter a couple times on this trial, on this particular cell. And what it did here is it put /n. That is if you want E prime to have a character return in it. I don't necessarily need a character return, so I won't do that. And if you just delete them, then they'll go away. And change my last one to R. So now my list object should match my list here. And it looks like it does pretty well. Perfect. Now if you notice, my attributes are still called something very generic. They're called attribute 1, attribute 2, and attribute 3. All I need to do is rename them to match my prac list here. So image correct answer in mirror. So I double click on it. It allows me to change the name here. I'll say image. Attribute 2 will be correct answer. And attribute 3 is of course going to be called mirror. There, so now I have my list object all set up. The only thing I really needed to change was the first letter in all of these columns, or in all of these image cells, and that was really it. So now I'm going to go and change sequential selection to random again. So order and set to random. But I'm also going to change the reset exit properties, because I don't believe 24 is enough trials. I'm actually going to change this to 48 trials. And I'm going to do that just by clicking on this exit after, and I can do cycles, and I can exit after 48 samples. If I want and make it a nice round number, I can actually go to this one, and I can change it to after 50 samples. So E prime is actually going to cycle through 50 of these, even though there are only 24. It'll sample a couple multiple times until it hits number 50. And if I want to, I can actually set a time limit for this list object. Let's say if I want participants to answer as many as they can in 2 minutes. I can change this to 120 seconds, and then they only have 2 minutes to go through this list object. But in this case, I'm just going to change it to 2 cycles of 48 samples. I'm going to click apply and OK. So E prime will now run through this list object twice, presenting each one randomly twice. So now comes the easy part. I've already made my fixation my stimulus object, and there's no point in making them again. So all I'm going to do is just take a fixation object, drag it into my trial proc, and now it's just referenced in 2 places, which makes my experiment much more efficient. And I'm going to do the same thing to my stimulus object, and I should be good to go. So now I add one more object to my experiment to kind of round it out. And if I go into my session proc here, I'm just going to add a goodbye slide, or a goodbye text display. And it's going to be after my block list. I'm just going to rename this to goodbye. And if I go ahead and double click on this, I'll just say thank you very much for your participation. And I'm just going to change a couple of the duration input properties here. My duration I will set to 3 seconds. And I change my data logging to time audit only, and that's all I need to change about my goodbye object. Alright, so now that I have my experiment set up, I do want to test it to make sure that I have everything set up correctly. So I'm going to test in windowed mode one more time. But instead of having me sit there and go through, click, click, click with everything, I'm going to actually ramp it up to 4 times its normal speed. And I'm going to enable auto response, so ePrime is going to auto respond with the keyboard. And then if I go down through here, I'm actually going to not run through any of my practice procedures. So I'm actually going to keep these checked because the fact that these are checked affects down here. But I'm not going to run through any of my practice trials. You saw I unselected this practice trial list, and I unselected this prac begin. Welcome isn't selected either. I'm going to re-add welcome. So now the only thing that should run is my block list. And it's going to run at 4 times normal speed with auto response. So let's see that go. And I'll actually change this to 2 for my subject. There you go. And this is ePrime auto responding. It looks like all of my letters are being referenced correctly. Oh. So here's a good place to stop here. So right now an error just came up. It says no such file name. So it's having trouble finding a file called n/rotate. Let's go ahead and click OK. And let's go ahead and take a look here. So if I look here, there actually isn't an n-rotate. It's only n-mirror and n-normal. So if I go into my trial list here, I can get rid of n-rotate. And there isn't an n-mirror 2 either. So I'm just going to delete this entire level. There we go. And now my experiment should run. So what I'm actually going to do when I run this is I'm just going to also run the practice trials as well, just so I have a full data set. Actually, no, I'm going to keep those unchecked because I already ran through the practice data once. So I'm going to click test. I'm just going to enter the same subject and session and just going to let it go again. And this is really the value of this test mode here. So along with having in its own window that it can display like this, you can also kind of parse your experiment for errors like this. And it's not taking much time since it's running at 4 times its normal speed. So if I get an error in tests like this, it's pretty quick to just jump right back in it and test now that you've fixed or rectified one of those errors. So ePrime's just auto-responding at this point. As you can see here, my correct answer was changing. There was my goodbye slide. So it's all done. I'm going to click exit, and I'm going to go to my edat3 file quickly just to take a look. And there it is. So as you can see, I have way more trials than before. I can go ahead and trim down my data file just a little bit. Remove all, take a look at RT, RESP, accuracy, and mirror. Add those back. If you ever get to this point in your experiment and you're like, oh, I want other columns back and you want to restore the spreadsheet, just click on this Restore Spreadsheet button and it'll add everything back. But more importantly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my analysis file that I had made earlier with my practice files. So I'm going to click on Load Analysis, and I'm going to look at RT and ACC by mirror state again. And if I do that, ePrime will automatically fill in everything that I had made before or had done before, and if I click Run, it's going to give me the same data. So it looks like the computer, because I was the one responding this time, actually had a higher accuracy when it was mirrored than when it wasn't mirrored, and it looks like they responded much faster to the non-mirrored states. Again, just a computer automatically responding, so this data isn't, extremely valuable, but it's nice to see. And now I know that whenever I run my subjects through this, or run my participants through this, I'm going to get the data that I want, and it's going to look exactly the way that I want it to. Alright, so that is all the content I have for today. If you guys have any more questions, please feel free to go to support.pstnet.com. It's our product, service, and support site. You can find our sample of this on there. You can always download it. It looks very similar to this. If you have any more specific questions, go ahead and shoot us a support ticket. Just click on submit a ticket at the very top of the window. We'd be happy to help you with that. As always, feel free to like and subscribe. It kind of lets us do what we do and lets us keep doing these webinars. If you have any recommendations for future paradigms or experiments or concepts in ePrime that you'd like to see, feel free to leave us a comment. I'm always happy to kind of edit these webinars or make new ones based on what you guys want. So yeah, thank you guys very much and have a great day.